So today's video is on photosynthesis, and it might seem pretty straightforward. You shine some sunlight, you sprinkle some rainwater, you add some carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and through photosynthesis, plants will give off oxygen and will create simple sugars such as glucose. But the actual process is a lot more complex. So let's get started. So the sun gives off a variety of types of energy, and this energy travels across space in the form of a wave, and the titles of the energy you can see at the top of the picture. Now we're going to focus our attention on visible light because it's the wavelength of visible light that drives and powers photosynthesis. Well, let's focus on how light is absorbed, and when we do, we're going to see that the sun gives off visible light, also called white light. White light is actually a mixture of Roy G. Biv. And what this is are the colors of the rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. All of these colors are a mixture known as white light. Well, how do we know this? Because when you shine light into a prism, when you shine white light into a prism, a rainbow comes out the other end. Just like you can see in this animation. White light is entering from the left, and because of the curvature of the prism, Roy G. Biv, the colors of the rainbow are coming out the other end. Notice how the wavelengths are different. Red has a longer wavelength, violet has a more narrow. And so this is how we know that white light is made from a mixture of these colors. Here's an actual picture of white light entering a prism, and you can see on the left-hand side a rainbow is coming out the back end. Moisture in the air can act like a prism and create a rainbow. You ever notice after it rains, you can sometimes see a rainbow in the sky, or in this case, near a waterfall. Because of all the moisture in the sky, the moisture separates the sunlight into the rainbow colors that you see. And so colors are either reflected or absorbed. When sunlight shines on an object, what we see is reflected light. The reason this leaf appears green is because it's reflecting the green wavelength of light. When light shines on these bananas, the reason it appears yellow is because the yellow wavelength reflects, while the other colors are absorbed. When we shine light on these balloons, the blue wavelength reflects into our eyes, and the other colors are absorbed. When we look at white objects like snow or this Arctic hare, the reason objects appear white is because white reflects all the colors, and all the wavelengths of light enter our eyes, and our brain interprets this as the color white. Well, the opposite would be black. When light shines on a black object, nothing reflects. It all is absorbed, and that's why this automobile appears black, because there's no light reflecting into our eyes. So when we relate this to photosynthesis, plants have mostly green leaves, which means that they're going to reflect the green wavelength, but the other colors are absorbing into the leaves and are going to be powering photosynthesis. In this graph, we can see, for instance, that this graph shows the wavelengths of light that most power photosynthesis. Notice how there's a peak around 400 nanometers. Well, that's the wavelength of blue. There's another peak around 700 nanometers. Well, that's the wavelength of red. So blue light and red light are most stimulating for plants in the process of photosynthesis. Ironically, the color green around 550 nanometers, the color green that we most associate with plants, actually has the least amount of impact in their ability to do photosynthesis. That's because most green light is reflecting. Very little green light is actually absorbing into the leaf. So when we look at a general definition of photosynthesis, it's the process that converts solar energy into glucose. And this formula here outlines photosynthesis. And in the reactants, we have carbon dioxide and water. And in the presence of sunlight, we'll produce sugars such as glucose and oxygen. Well, who performs photosynthesis? Well, these are the autotrophs. Now, we typically think of plants as doing photosynthesis, but they're not the only ones. Algae, Phytoplankton, the basis of ocean food webs. Kelp. Kelp can grow into these enormous underwater forests. And even some bacteria known as cyanobacteria are photosynthetic. So there's a lot more autotrophs than just plants. So photosynthesis is also what we call an endergonic chemical reaction. And what that means is that photosynthesis requires the input of energy. From the picture, I'm implying that sunlight. Sunlight is the energy that is input to power photosynthesis. And when we talk about the end result, what's created? Well, oxygen, which is a waste gas, and simple sugars like glucose. But when we zoom on into the leaf, we find some peculiar pores on their underside. These pores will open and close, and they're called stomata, and it's how they exchange gases. It's how they take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and when they produce oxygen as a waste, through these stomata openings, they give off the oxygen created. So it's through these pores that they exchange gas with the atmosphere. Okay, so now let's introduce the structure in cells that allows them to do photosynthesis, and this is the chloroplast. What we're going to do is we're actually going to divide photosynthesis into two stages. Stage one being the stage that depends upon sunlight, the light-dependent reactions. And these take place in the thylakoid membranes of a chloroplast. You know, I want to actually look at a more simplified diagram here. And when we do, we can actually see the thylakoids, which kind of look like coins or frisbees stacked on top of one another. Well, in the membrane of these thylakoids is where the light-dependent reactions occur. And if you ever come across the term granum, that's a term that means a stack of thylakoids. Okay, so you see that flashing black box? I want to zoom into that area of the chloroplast. And when we do, we're going to see that there's some things actually embedded within the membrane of the thylakoid. I've labeled them PS1 and PS2, and these are the photosystems, and we're going to talk about them in more detail, but for now, in the photosystems is where we find chlorophyll and various protein molecules that are responsible for capturing and transferring energy during the light-dependent reactions. And it's during the light-dependent reactions where oxygen, ATP, and something called NADPH is created. We'll talk about these molecules in more detail coming up very shortly. And then we'll shift into stage two, the light-independent reactions. And this happens or occurs in the stroma, the fluid-filled interior of the chloroplast, just outside of the thylakoid. And it's in stage two, the light-independent reactions, where glucose is actually created. So let's talk about these two stages for the rest of this video. So now let's get into some of the details of the light-dependent reactions. And what we're going to do is we're going to break this down into a few steps. So step number one, chlorophyll in photosystem number 2 will absorb sunlight. Now, even though it's called photosystem number 2, it's actually the first in the chain of events. They were named photosystem 1 and photosystem 2 by order in which they were discovered, not the order in which they perform their function. So you kind of have to get over that backwards name right there. So in my animation, sunlight is striking the chlorophyll molecules in photosystem number 2, and this causes their electrons to become excited. And what happens is the electrons actually flow into the thylakoid membrane. And so as these electrons from chlorophyll in photosystem number 2 flow through the thylakoid membrane, this makes the membrane negatively charged. And as the electrons are flowing through, there's also proteins embedded within the thylakoid membrane that are aiding their travel. I just didn't show them in my animation. But this starts what we call an electron transport chain. It's a chain of events set in motion by these electrons. So when we move on into the second step, I've added some hydrogen ions into the stroma because there's dissolved molecules and ions in the stroma, and these hydrogens are going to play an important role. And so what happens is as the electrons move through the thylakoid membrane, they actually will operate in power and turn on these protein pumps that will pull the hydrogens into the thylakoids. And as more and more and more hydrogens accumulate, this is going to make a really large concentration of hydrogens, which we'll see why that's important in a little bit. I also want to mention that water molecules are broken. So here's a water molecule, and with the help of enzymes, the hydrogens are broken off, and the electron from the hydrogen went into photosystem number 2. Here we go again. Enzymes will break off the hydrogen, and notice how the electrons were pulled into photosystem number 2. You know, photosystem number 2 has been losing electrons, and so it's water's, the hydrogen of water, it's their electrons that will replenish photosystem number 2 so it doesn't run out of electrons, and so this process can keep going. This is why you have to constantly water a plant. Also, oxygen. This is where the oxygen comes from. See that O for oxygen? It will bond with another O from another water that was broken to make O2. The oxygen that we breathe used to be attached to water, which I think is kind of interesting. So, as we move on into the next step, again, sunlight is striking photosystem number 2, and its electrons are moving through the thylakoid membrane. But you know, sunlight is also striking photosystem number 1. And photosystem number 1 is filled with chlorophyll, and it has electrons that also become excited and move through the thylakoid membrane. So what we really have is kind of a longer electron transport chain. So now that we have our full electron transport chain, let's move on to the next step. And in the next step, a molecule called NADPH will be created. So in the stroma, NADP and a hydrogen are drawn together. And the electrons of the electron transport chain help these two bond together to make a really important molecule called NADPH. NADPH can be kind of be viewed as a carrier of hydrogen, like a taxi whose job it is to carry hydrogen from one place to another. We'll come back to it in a little bit, but it's really important that NADPH was just created. So at this stage, the hydrogen is really beginning to accumulate inside the thylakoid from the breaking of water, from the electron transport chain pulling in hydrogens from the outside. So by now, there's a really large concentration of hydrogens inside the thylakoid. So when we come to our next step, because there's such a large amount of them, the hydrogens are going to start to diffuse through that enzyme labeled ATP synthase. And so what hydrogen does from a high to low concentration, it'll diffuse through ATP synthase and will help to bond a molecule of ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with another phosphate. And when that happens, they bond to make a molecule of ATP. And so this ATP, along with the NADPH, are really the most important things that are created during the light-dependent reactions. We're going to see what's so important about them in just a little bit. And so to summarize the light-dependent reactions, oxygen, NADPH, and ATP have been created. You know, sunlight was taken in, water was taken in, and oxygen was released as a waste. And in the light-dependent reactions, NADPH and ATP have been created. I do want to note at this stage, no glucose has been created. So let's move on to the light-independent reactions. Okay, so the light-independent reactions. You know, this is also known as the Kelvin cycle, named after the scientist who helped to identify these steps. And so we're going to start breaking it down. First of all, there's a 5-carbon molecule by the name of RUBP, ribulose biphosphate. Now, it has more than just 5 carbons. You can see 12 hydrogens, 11 oxygens, and 2 phosphoruses. But for simplicity, I've only drawn the 5 carbons of RUBP. And what happens is RUBP bonds with a molecule of carbon dioxide. And when they bond, they make a very short-lived 6-carbon molecule. The 5 carbons from RUBP plus the 1 from carbon dioxide make this very short-lived 6-carbon molecule. So the reason this 6-carbon molecule is short-lived is we finally get to see the importance of ATP and NADPH, which were created during the light dependent cycle. This 6-carbon molecule is going to be broken down by the energy contained within ATP and NADPH. And enzymes will help to break down ATP and NADPH to release their energy. And when the energy is released, that 6-carbon molecule is broken down into 2 molecules called phosphoglycerate. Each PGA, or phosphoglycerate, is 3 carbons in size. And by the way, the NADP and the ADP that are left over will be reused and recycled in the next light-dependent reaction. And so this happens multiple times. Here's another short-lived 6-carbon molecule broken down by NADPH and ATP to make 2 more molecules of phosphoglycerate. And here's another 6-carbon molecule broken down by another NADPH and another ATP to make 2 more molecules of the phosphoglycerates. So what happens now with these phosphoglycerates? Well, some of those 3-carbon phosphoglycerates are going to bond with one another, and with the help of enzymes, they're going to bond to make simple sugars, such as glucose. And that's the whole point of photosynthesis, is to make glucose. Now, not all the phosphoglycerates do this. Some of the phosphoglycerates are going to help to keep the cycle going. And so what happens is they're going to be broken down. They're going to be broken down with the help of ATP to keep the cycle going. And when ATP breaks some of these other phosphoglycerates down, they're broken down. And then enzymes help to build that same 5-carbon molecule we saw earlier, ribulose biphosphate. And now we're repeating the Calvin cycle, the light-independent reactions. The process simply restarts because carbon dioxide will bond with this 5-carbon RUBP. And when they bond, they make that short-lived 6-carbon molecule that we mentioned earlier. And the process repeats itself. So to summarize the light-independent reactions, carbon dioxide, ATP, and NADPH are going to create glucose. So when carbon dioxide is added to the ATP and NADPH from the light-dependent reactions, with the help of enzymes, you have simple sugars such as glucose created. Okay, so if you're in my biology class, we'll talk about this essay question in class. And there you have it. As we wind down this video, pause it, try to answer these questions, and put your comments in the box below. I hope you found this video helpful. Thanks for watching.